Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And as we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning, and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So thank you everyone for coming to today's workshop.
All right, so welcome to this workshop on Q methodology. My name is Gary Bonar. I'm based here at Monash University in Melbourne. And what I'm going to, first of all, maybe just start with a acknowledgement of country. So I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people. So I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners, also pay respect to the elders, past and present, and the Aboriginal elders or other communities who may be here today. So I've done a few workshops on Q, both in person and online, and this is a structure that I've found that kind of works quite well for most people. I'm going to assume that most of you, if not all of you, maybe are new to Q. I know some of you are not, but I will start just from the basics, a bit of the origins of Q, some of the sort of theoretical foundations of it, but also mix it up with some practical things, like I'll show you what the participant experience is, for example, an online Q sort. I'll go through the process in detail. We'll look at some of the software options to do the analysis. And if there's time, I'll kind of run through what an analysis can look like for you, how you can do Q with other things, other stimulus such as images, or you can do a whole range of different types of studies, even working with younger children, pre-literate or illiterate participants. And also if you're looking at Q as maybe an initial stage of them maybe doing a larger scale survey, or you want to do some longitudinal studies. So that's the plan. And hopefully we'll also talk about publishing, some tips that I've picked up and other people about if you're publishing a Q article, some of the ways to approach that. The presentation, there's some pauses I've built into it. So feel free, if you've got questions that come up as I'm talking, you can just jump into the chat, type them in, or when I get to those pause screens, just feel free to turn on your microphone and ask away. Particularly if something I've explained is not clear, it's probably better to be clear on that before we go too far ahead. Otherwise, it won't make sense, the rest of my talk there. So what is Q? Basically, it's very simple. It's just a methodology where the participants are sorting a sampled set of statements, and then you as the researcher, you're analysing patterns in that, how they've sorted those statements. And the idea is you're trying to find out, are there any shared viewpoints or perspectives amongst my participants? So that's kind of pretty much, if you had to describe it, that's basically what it is. So normally in Q, we're looking to sort of uncover different patterns of thought, not so much the numerical distribution. So it's not really going to help you to say, X number of people think B, X number of people think Y. It's more, what do people think? What are the ideas out there? So sort of, you can think of it as identifying typologies, not to really test their distribution amongst a larger population. And that, likewise, it's not really a method that's suitable for testing a hypothesis. It's not really going to give you the data that's going to help you really test that. It's more about like exploring sort of unknown things, where you've got questions about maybe some sort of complex research topic, or might be a socially contested things, and you're trying to find out what are the main shared viewpoints amongst this particular group that I want to explore. One thing I think is really important to keep in mind is that doing a Q study, like preparing it, administering it, analysing it, is quite complex. It can take a bit of time. And it also can be complex for your participants, because most of them probably have never done a Q sort before. So it's more demanding than probably what they're used to doing a survey. So if you are thinking of doing a Q study, it's not something you can do well in a short amount of time. You really need to think about it and plan ahead. So in terms of the foundations of Q, if you're someone, I'm not sure, some of you may be more from the qualitative domain, others more quantitative. When you look at Q, you think, well, this seems to combine both. You've got some quantitative data and qualitative data, and that can be a strength, but it also can lead to confusion, particularly, say, if you're coming more from a quantitative perspective, and you look at Q, you might think, oh, this is familiar to me. It's got factor analysis. I can sort of engage with that. But when you're doing a Q study, you'll soon realize that there's a lot more required of you as the researcher than maybe what you might be used to if that's your sort of background there. So this is a quote from Zabala et al. Saying that it's important for anyone considering the use of Q to recognize as a methodology, it is based on philosophical and epistemological premises that are non-positivist. All right. So you as the researcher, you're not a neutral actor trying to find this sort of truth which is out there. You're kind of engaged, deeply in every step, making decisions, choosing your statements, choosing how you're going to arrange them, choosing the grid, all the way through, right through from the first step right to the end. So just be aware of that. That's something you just need to consider, and just the idea of being transparent about that as well. So all those decisions you make, making sure that you're really rigorous in keeping track for those, because that's something you'll need to maybe include when you write it up. You might get a question from a reviewer asking you, how did you decide the number of factors? How did you decide your statements? You want all that information to be really transparent and clear. So I mentioned it's sort of, is it a mixed methods? There's a bit of debate in the Q community about this, because some people look at it and say, yeah, well, we've got this factor analysis stage where we're getting data reduction. We're trying to find these shared viewpoints. And then typically when you do a Q study, you'll do an interview with the participants, ideally immediately after they've done the Q sort. So it looks like you've got those two types of data there. So yeah, mixed methods, that's true in some respects. But people such as Stenner would argue that it's not just as simple as that. It's much more the actual Q sorting process is also in some ways a qualitative process. All right, because the participants are looking at the statements, and their qualitative interpretation of those statements is then what then turns into the numerical data that you're then starting to analyze. So to say it's just mixed methods because you've got those two sort of separate things is not quite probably the full picture. Many people would argue that the whole actual process of creating the statements and the participant engaging with them is also an aspect of sort of qualitative data. Oh, by the way, so I'm happy to share these slides with you at the end. You'll find there's quite a lot of text on them. I do that because if you later on want to go back and look at something, the information is quite clear. So feel free, if you want to get these slides, I'll happily share them with you. Another thing you might be thinking of, well, where does Q sit in terms of other types of methodologies, such as surveys or Likert-style questionnaires? One thing a lot of people will say when they're doing Q is that it's the difference is that the participants are maybe kind of less passive in some ways. I don't mean that in a negative way, but when you're doing a Q sort, you're not just sort of ticking little, 1, 2, 3 on this questionnaire. You're actually in there making decisions about which statements you feel more strongly about. And you'll see this when I show you a Q sort. The participant is cognitively quite challenged to sort of decide what they think about the topic. So that is also a strength, and you'll see that as I go through, because you're getting to engage really deeply in the topic. When you get to the interview phase of it, they're already kind of set up to really engage in a deeper way than if you just maybe did an interview with people and gave them questions that they sort of were thinking of in the moment. So the Q sort as a data collection is really powerful, but it also really sets up well to do a really detailed interview with them to really find out why they think the things they've they've demonstrated in the Q sort. The other thing about Q is that it's quite novel for most people, even though it's a methodology which is expanding quite rapidly in a range of fields, including applied linguistics. For most of your participants, it's probably quite new to them. So that novelty of it can be quite appealing. It's almost like doing a jigsaw puzzle when we're deciding what the picture will look like in the end, because they're moving cards around. So where people are often sort of survey fatigued, another survey, and they may just be whizzing through, clicking things without really, engaging deeply, the Q, a good Q study will really sort of force them, if you like, to really think about the statements you're presenting and really think about what they really believe there. So that can be quite appealing too. And I've done quite a lot of Q studies where the participants will say, I really enjoyed doing that. It was difficult, but it really made me think about what I really believe or what my viewpoint is. And I kind of mentioned this before, the interviews, and typically you want to try and do those as close as possible to the Q sort. They can really then, go into really detail because you've got the Q sort there in front of you, and you can ask them specific questions about why they agreed with this statement versus this statement and so on. So that's one of the, I would say one of the advantages of doing Q versus maybe surveys where sometimes you're not quite sure if have they really engaged with this, or are they just clicking through to try and get to the end to get maybe a voucher or something. So that's kind of just setting up a bit of the overall what Q is. I'll just take you now to some of the key people in the Q, some of and the key text. So this gentleman on the left here, William Stevenson, he was actually the originator of Q. He originally wrote a letter to the journal Nature to sort of suggest this method. He was someone who did two PhDs. There are people who do two, one in physics, one in psychology, and one of his supervisors or mentors was Charles Spearman. So some of you will probably know that name as kind of the pioneers of factor analysis. So what Stevenson was trying to do was use that factor analysis, but do it as in terms of sort of rotating it, if you like. So the studying subjectivity, but a people's first-person perspective on a topic. So he proposed the idea of reversing or rotating conventional factor analysis so that the people became the variables. So the quote from him was, any person in principle can be made the subject of detailed factor and variance analysis. Okay. So using the language of the time, this idea of operant activity. So Q sort is an operant activity through which participants actively construct and communicate their viewpoint. So the idea was subjectivity could be made manifest and observable and studied through doing the Q sort. So the book there on the right, the study of behavior Q technique, just a word on terminology. Sometimes you'll see Q technique in older literature. Nowadays it's more Q methodology, as in the whole process. Sometimes Q technique is just the factor analysis part of it. So just the slight differences in terminology there. That book is quite an interesting book to read, quite detailed. It's probably not the most helpful book if you want to do a Q study because it doesn't really take you through the process. But if you want to learn more about his thinking of why he came up with this idea, that's definitely a book to have a look at. The next one is probably then getting into more the sort of useful sort of text for Q studies. So this is Professor Stephen Brown, based in Kent State University in the US. So he was actually a PhD student of Stevenson. Stevenson moved to the US, and Stephen Brown was his one of his students. His area was political science, but he wrote this book, Political Subjectivity, about Q. So the book is basically divided into two parts. First part is more about in terms of political science, and part two is more almost like a handbook of doing a Q study. So it steps you through the whole process of creating the statements and creating the sort and then doing the analysis there. So a quote from him is, fundamentally, Q methodology provides a foundation for the systematic study of subjectivity and is this central feature which recommends it to persons interested in qualitative aspects of human behaviour. Only subjective opinions are at issue in Q, and although they are typically unprovable, they can nevertheless be shown to have structure and form. Right, and that's the Q sort. And it is the task of the Q technique to make the form manifest for purposes of observation and study. That book is available freely. You can download it as a PDF, and there's also a series of videos online you can watch for that link on YouTube. They're very old videos, but it was a workshop he ran in the States many, many years ago, but they did videos of it, and he kind of steps you through the whole process of doing a Q study. So also well worth looking at. Moving up more to current times, this book here by Simon Watts and Paul Stenner is probably the book you'll see referenced a lot by people doing Q studies because it's much more of a practical guidebook to doing Q. So they're both more in the field of psychology, but using Q and stepping you through both the sort of foundations of it, but also each stage of doing a Q study there. There is a version of that you can get through the SAGE methods link, which is on the site there. And they also have published quite a lot of papers as well, so well worth having a look at. And then, as I said, with the growth of Q, there are more and more publications coming out. So the one on the left there, Advancing Language Research through Q Methodology. So I have a chapter in there with some colleagues, which I'll use as the sort of sample Q short. I'll show you Q sort. I'll show you a little bit later on. But then Stephen Brown and Diane Montgomery with one for education. And then Sue Ramlow is very active in the Q community, one looking at subjectivity. And these are just a couple or a few of the more and more publications coming out about using Q. So I did mention there would be some pauses along the way. I haven't looked at the chat, but I can't see anything at the moment. Maybe I'll just pause and give you a second in case there are any questions you'd like to ask before I move on. It's fine if there aren't. It's just always good to pause and let people just in case. Okay. Well, as I said, feel free to, there's be a few of these pauses throughout. So if you've got a question that comes up, you can either type it in or feel free to turn on your microphone as we go through. Okay, so that's kind of a bit of the background, a bit of the theory. Now we'll look at just the process and I'll show you what a Q sort looks like from the participant perspective. So this is sort of a visual representation of it. Each of these stages I'll talk about in more detail a little bit later in this workshop. But basically it starts off with your research question. As I said, something kind of exploratory is typically what you'll see in a Q study. And it tends to be something quite confined. So you're looking at some particular thing, you're trying to find out what do people think about this particular topic there. So then from that, you'll have your condition of instruction, which is what the participant is going to be looking at and thinking of as they're thinking about the statements and how they feel about them. Okay, and you'll see this in the sample I'll show you. Typically, it might be something like they agree with it, they disagree, or like their view, not like their view, some sort of continuum of viewpoints there. Concourse is a term specific to Q. It's sort of basically the whole theoretically infinite discourse around a topic. So that can come from a whole range of sources, and I'll talk more about that as we go through. But there's basically your concourse is the big sort of set of ideas or comments or thoughts about a topic. And then from that, you'll then pull out your Q set, or you'll sample the concourse to get the statements that you want people to respond to. And as I said, I'll talk more about that in a minute, but basically there's a few things to think about when you're deciding which statements you're going to get people to respond to. You'll then have a grid. Typically, it's a like this sort of normal type distribution, and typically it's a forced distribution. You can do unforced, where people can put statements wherever they like, but typically most Q studies, they'll have some sort of grid so the participants have to choose, for example, the two statements they agree with the most or disagree with the most, for example. The P sample refers to the participants. So generally, this is not supposed to be like a representative sample of the population. It's more people who have some maybe knowledge of the topic, or they have an idea or some viewpoint which may be interesting. Right? So it tends to be more of a purposive group of participants. You're trying to find out what they think about this topic there. In terms of the sort, there are a few options these days. Traditionally, it was done paper-based, and I would say a lot of people in Q would say that if you've got the option of doing paper face-to-face, that's probably the best way to do it. But there are now online options, and you can also do hybrid options as well, which I'll talk about as well. Once you've collected the Q sorts, then you move to the analysis, and there's specific software for Q, and luckily the main ones are free. You can download and use them on a variety of platforms. And that's where you're doing the factor analysis to kind of like reduce the data down into kind of looking for those kind of shared perspectives. So going through those steps there, and then you get to the interpretation. And even before the interpretation, but particularly in interpretation, that's where you might be looking also at things such as the interview data. You also might look at any other demographic data you've collected about participants to try and find out, well, here's what they think. This is the sort of 3, 4, whatever main ideas I've identified. What is it that helps me understand these ideas? And that's often where the interview data gives you a bit of flesh to put onto those narratives there. So let me show you then what that would look like from a participant perspective. And I mentioned this is from a study I've been doing for about 4 or 5 years now, kind of longitudinal Q study. I work with, I teach the language method units here at Monash University, Faculty of Education. So my students are pre-service teachers of various languages, and I've been doing a Q study with participants, both with the same participants over time and with different participants each year, looking at things such as their sense of ownership or legitimacy as a language teacher, their language teacher identity, issues around well-being, agency, and so on. So that's the kind of the bigger picture, and this is one of the chapters from that. And let me jump over. Hopefully, can you see a different screen now showing you? Yep, okay. So this would be if you were doing an online Q sort. And again, there's a few options here. In this one, they get sent a link, they click on it, and this is what they see. What I tend to do with online ones, I like to do it within like a Zoom meeting like this. So for example, if you were my participants, individually, I would send you a Zoom link, and in that Zoom link, you would click on the Q sort link. And then I say, right, here's the thing. I'm going to turn off my camera. I'll give you 20, 30, 40 minutes, as long as you like. Do the Q sort. I'll be here. I can hear you if you've got a question, if you get stuck. But then once you've done, tell me, and then we can come back and we can talk about your Q sort. So even though they're doing it online, I like to do it kind of and be there with them because, as I said, most people haven't done a Q sort before. So they can get lost. They're not sure what to do, or the software might cause issues. So I think that's a good way to ensure integrity and also sort of preempt any particular issues. But it is also possible just to send the link and they do it in their own time, and then you can look at the data. The only thing with that is if you do the interview later on, their recollection of their Q sort, the longer you leave it, it may become less and less vivid in their mind. All right. So if you can, the sooner you can do the interview, if you are doing interviews, which are also optional, I think the better in terms of data collection. So imagine your participants here. You've got this thing, a welcome. Another thing I sometimes often do is I might create a little video that they can click on that steps them through. So like a 2 or 3 minute video saying, this is what you're going to be doing, and this is the different steps. Because as I said, you're really not sure if they're looking at on a tablet, on a computer. It's not going to work on a phone very well. Some people do try to do it, but it doesn't work that way, as you will see. But just kind of think about all the potential issues your participants might encounter and try and preempt those. So this is what they see. They get, your ethics information there. They can read that, click on something else. But normally at QSort, there are 2 stages. The first stage is you getting them to look at the statements and then their first initial impression. Is this something they feel something towards, like agree or disagree, or like their view or unlike their view? Or are they kind of indifferent or unsure, not know? Okay. So this step here is helpful in a number of ways. So on this particular platform, what they do is they can just drag it into the column. You can also use the number key, 1, 2, 3, and I'll move it over here. Okay. Now they can also move things back and forward. Okay, so they're not locked in, and even what they do on this screen, they can still make changes later. So if they've put something like my view here, but then later on they realize maybe they misread it, they can still put that in not like their view, so that it's not locked in. The purpose of this step, there's a couple of reasons why this is useful. First of all, it lets them start to engage with the statements so they can start to think about it, okay? If you were to present all the statements to them at once and say, right, sort these on the grid, that's a lot of things they need to think about. Here you get them to focus on one thing and what's their first reaction to it. Okay? So as they drag them over and drop them in, one thing you as a researcher will be looking at, both if you were doing it in person, particularly during the pilot stage, which I'll talk about later, you want to look for, do they put a lot of the statements in the agree column? Like, do you have, in this case, we've got 38 statements. Are they putting 30 in the agree column? All right. So that might be an indication that your statements are too skewed to one particular viewpoint. All right. Not that you have to have a balance. It doesn't need to be perfectly balanced, but it might be an indication that you haven't really looked at the concourse and you haven't extracted statements which are fully representative of the diversity of viewpoints on that particular topic there. Because what can happen is, as you see when we get to the next step, if the participant's got like 30 statements in the agree column here, when they start to spread them on the grid, some of those statements will start to go into the sort of disagree areas, and that can make people feel uncomfortable because they think, I actually agree with this, but I have to put it into this -2 or -3. So that's where you just be mindful of that. This software will actually give you those numbers. So you see later on in this first stage, they put 20 statements in this column, 10 in here, and 10 in there. But during the pilot stage, that's a good thing to be aware of. So as I said, they drag these in. Sorry, Ek, I didn't see your hand there. Go ahead. You got a question?
I have maybe 2 small questions.
Sure.
The first question is, would they see all the statements beforehand before they drag in and out, or is it just coming up as they work through? And the second question is, would it be possible to do, maybe if you do the Zoom like this, to record their sessions like this, because then you can do a bit of like retrospective interviews, or you can see the process of their moving through, making their sorting like decisions and so on. So I have 2 questions. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. So at this stage, they don't see all the statements. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, you could send them all the statements beforehand and say, have a read of these, if you wanted to. But at this stage, you kind of really want to minimize the cognitive load, so they're not having to think of too many things. Because if they see all the statements at first, they might already start to making decisions about them. not necessarily a bad thing, but here you really want them just to focus on that individual one and what's their sort of gut reaction to it. Yeah. In terms of recording, yeah, that's one of the good things about Zoom. And what I do when I do using Zoom and doing online sorts, I do the recording from the start. And what I said, I turn off my camera so they don't see me kind of watching them, but I'm recording them as they're going through. But even if you were doing it in person, you'd be sitting there maybe to the side in the room, and as they're doing it, you may be watching them, looking at the statements they're putting. Sometimes they'll also say things like they might ask you, "What does this mean?" or clarifying things. With that, you might respond to that. You just got to be careful, I guess, to try and keep the conditions similar for all your participants, so you're not sort of kind of compromising some of the data. But that can be also good to see, are there certain statements they're really struggling over? And is it just because of the wording, or is it because of, there are too many statements that are in, least like my view, most like my view? So does that answer your question there?
Yes, absolutely. Because I would imagine that there would be a particular statement that it would require them to take more time to think about. And that might be something that we can follow up. For example, like
Definitely.
spend so much time flipping back and forth of the same items across. And in the end, you make that decision to put it, say, most likely my view. What were your thought about that at the time? Maybe that could be something like this that might be useful, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. In fact, as they're doing it, even though my camera's off, I'm kind of watching and seeing and making notes of which statement they might have moved around. And if it looks like it's something important, then I can bring that up in the interview as well. Yeah. Okay, so as I said, this is the first step. What I'll do is quickly go through this. So one other thing about the colors. So this software is the free software, but it's really good. The developer is constantly updating it. And you now have an option to turn off colors. And I think that's a good thing because I think sometimes, as you'll see later on, when they have the color and they go into the negative, but it's a green statement, some people just find that just a bit jarring. So as I said, I'll just go through till we get to the next step. So they've got all 38 statements in that first step there. And then we should be able to go to the next step. Just drag that in. Okay. So let me move this out the way. So this is step 2. Now you're getting them to make decisions here. And I tend to tell people to start maybe from the ones they've agreed with the most and start to look through them and put them onto the grid, depending on how they feel about it. All right. So, for example, they go down, they get a statement and say, yeah, I kind of agree with this. Oh, this one I feel really strongly about. Now, I'll talk about the grid and how many columns and things as we get later on, but this is totally up to you how you configure the grid. All right, so yeah, question there from Ling Ling. Do we set up a particular platform for Q like this? The one, yeah, so I'll show you the some of the software. So this is a free version, so you can create this online interface, and the data goes to a database you can then download. There are also some paid versions. I've used some of the paid ones as well, and they'll have everything kind of self-contained. But I find the free ones tend to work quite well. Yeah, Ayak, you got a
And I
question as
have
well?
just a quick question. You mentioned that the software owners would like to move the colors out, right? But I can see the benefits of having the colors there because it'd be unusual to put the green into the red, right? I mean, it's a kind of good way of sorting out your thoughts around this.
Yeah. Look, the good thing is it's not like you can choose. If you want to have colors, you can have colors on your grid. All right. But you've got the option of taking the colors away. And I'll show you why. So as I said, they're moving them around, but then they can also, in this case, they can move them around still, like if they change their mind. All right. But they've got to put them, in this case, this is a forced distribution. So they need to make choices and put them in one of the cells here. Okay. So you can imagine if this was paper-based, it's pretty much the same sort of thing. They're looking at the statements and placing them on the grid. The reason why you might want to get colours, and I'm not sure if it's going to work on this one if I didn't overload one of the columns, but you can imagine if you had a lot on the red, more than, and they started to go into the green because you ran out of spaces, some people look at it and say, well, actually, I don't want that because I agree with that, or I disagree with that, but it looks like I agree with it. So the colours can be a way just to sort of remove that reminder, all right? It's still, they might still say, well, I actually agree with that. But the thing is, with Q, unlike a survey where they can just answer each item discreetly and each question kind of stands alone, in Q, they're having to make decisions. Yes, I agree with this, I agree with this, and I agree with this, but which one do I agree with more? All right? So there's a relationship that is built into the Q sort between all the statements. And that's where the real power of it is, because you can say, okay, if I did a survey and I answered, 5 to 3 statements, like the maximum, you would know I agreed with those, but you wouldn't know which one I agree with the most. In Q, you're getting that information through the Q sort. They're having to make that choice there. Okay. With the neutral, well, it's not really neutral because it's more, I guess, less salient in a way, because some people still might have ideas about these. They might still have opinions of it. It's just that they're not as strongly held as they are with the other statements. Okay. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that at the top there, that's the condition of sort. All right. So when I think of being a language teacher, I believe. So that's the thing they had to sort of keep in their mind as they were arranging the statements there. As they do this, they can still go around and move things around in this one, just as they could do on a paper-based one. The thing they can't do, though, is put things outside the grid, because what you'll see is that they won't be able to move forward. All right, the software won't let them go forward unless everything is in a particular cell, and that's why I think it's good to do Q sorts and observing people doing it, because sometimes some of these things here are not actually sitting in the cell properly, and that's why I can't go ahead. So somebody needs to jiggle them to make sure they are all kind of locked in the right position, and that's what's happened as I've just thrown them on there. So eventually it should get to the point where I can go forward. But while I'm doing that, are there other questions you'd like to ask me about?
Yes, for me,
Yep,
thank
go
you.
ahead.
I'm sorry asking you a lot of questions because
No,
I'm
great.
really interested in this. So because the more items, the more cognitive load, right? To do
Correct.
this, what's the optimal recommended number of items you think would work for this kind of sorting
Mm-hmm.
your experience? Because you want to make sure that they read properly and they think carefully, and because if too many, then it might becomes random for them. And of course, random could be possible, but we don't want that, right?
Sure. Yeah. So there's no real magic number, but there are some sort of guidelines on that. And I've got a slide that kind of talks about that. It also depends on your participants as well. So I've done Q sorts with 12, 13-year-olds, and you don't want to give them 50, 60 statements because it's just going to be too many. So it's partly depending on who your participants are, depends on the topic. Also depends on, I tend to do what are called structured Q sets. So my statements tend to fit within, or they align up with particular things I'm looking for in terms of they're based on the theory. So if you look at some of these statements, you'll see some of them are about native speaker identity. Some of them are about linguistic resources. Some of them are about their sense of authenticity as a teacher of languages. So these kind of tend to fit within theories which have informed my selection of statements. So typically with that, you might want to have a bit of a balance. So I remember from this one, I think there are like 5 sort of main, I guess, components to it. So each of those had about 6 or 7 statements that gave me enough there to be able to really explore it in detail. But in that book I showed you, they say 40 to 60 sometimes is a typical number. But again, it's not a something that's definitive. It often would depend on a range of factors there. Okay. So as you saw, as I jiggled those around, I finally got this continue thing to come up. So, they can still go and fine tune it if they want to. And then once they've done that, I tend to sometimes do some demographic questions as well. In this particular one, I asked them to write a bit more about the statements they placed at the extremities. All right. So if you weren't doing the interview with them, but you still wanted to collect that qualitative data, you could add some questions like this. So tell me a bit more about why you placed that statement at the ends of the grid there. Okay. Yep. Is it Jerry or?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, it's Gary. Hi. Just a question about does this software record how long it takes the participants to get through this? Because I think it's related to that cognitive load. When I put myself in this situation, it might take quite long.
Yeah.
So do you have any is this are these materials that you've used in a study? And if yes, do you have on average completion time?
Yeah. The good thing of this software, it does give you the time of when they started it until they finished it. So that's a good quality control as well. Very rarely I've had someone just kind of flick through. Most people, and maybe that's because I get them to do it and we're in a Zoom meeting. But if you were doing them remotely, you're just sending it out to them and you wanted to check, you could look at that, how long they spent. My experience is, again, depends on the topic, depends on age, depends on how many statements. But yeah, at least I would say 15, 20 minutes for them to sort of go through to really get a sense. Yeah, it looks like they've really read each statement. Also knowing that not every statement's going to resonate with people. They might, well, I don't really have any thoughts about this statement. So they might just be putting it sort of in the middle of the grid. They don't have to really be thinking about every single statement deeply. But this software does give you that idea of numbers. And also if you're doing in person, you could tell as well. Yeah. But it's a good point. The cognitive load is much more than a survey. So you always want to prepare people. So I say to them, look, make sure you've got an hour to do this, that you can concentrate without interruptions and focus, because they really do need to be kind of in the zone to really engage. Yep, hey, go ahead.
Just a quick question, Gary. Because I know it's about subjectivity and it's fine, right? But there could be some kind of stability in this kind of thing as well. Would there be any chance that we can ask them to redo this so that we can see if that changes? Am I even in a short period of time? Because the interest is not about stability as such, but if you believe that something is important today, it is likely that you also believe it to be the case tomorrow. At
100%.
least something. Would that be possible? Because they might change their mind.
Yeah. And there are two sort of scenarios. There have been studies done looking on how fixed people's viewpoints are. And obviously it depends on the topic. But they have shown that if it's something that some personal belief, it tends to be quite stable. But they're also accused, and with the longitudinal studies, I'm also looking at pre-service teachers. They go and do their placement, then they go become a graduate teacher. How stable are their viewpoints over time? Some of them are quite stable. Other ones are quite, they shift a lot. And often that's, the experiences they've had. You can also do Q as a sort of pre-post as well. So you do, there's a few studies where they do a Q sort, then there's some sort of intervention. One was I saw in the UK about teaching participants about leveraging students' multilingual resources. So they did some activities, some workshops, and they did a post-intervention Q study to see were their ideas the same or did the intervention make any difference there as well. So you could take both approaches for that. Okay. Jerry, that paper's there. I'll show that as we one of those ones that we'll get to. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so that's where they can write something about it.
Sorry, there is a question from Anthony in the chat.
Sorry, Anthony, go ahead.
Sorry, it might just be easier for me to ask it.
Sure.
I was just following up on Ling Ling's question of
Yep.
platforms for a Q sort like this. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this one, but I was wondering if you had any experience with other software programs or other, just to get a comparison.
Yeah. As I said, this is a free version, a free software. I've used another free one, which is okay, but there's a few more steps you've got to go through to access it. And also where the data is stored is not as, it didn't suit my sort of, in terms of the requirements of the study, because depending on ethics as well, sometimes these questions about where the data goes, if they're putting in identifiable information as well, something to be aware of. The paid versions tend to be, as you can imagine, a little bit more nicer looking, I guess, also from the participant perspective. But the ones I've used can be a bit expensive as well. It's like a subscription you pay for like 3 months access. It's like, $200 a month or something. So if you've got a study where you've got those funds, you might want to use those because they have the whole package where you create the Q sort, you send it out, the link, and the analysis is built in as well. So I would suggest playing around with the free ones because you've got some options there, and then looking at some of the paid ones as well to see if there's anything there that would be more beneficial for your study. Yeah. Okay. Yep. No worries, Nero. So you catch up the recording. All right. So as I said, they can type some information in there, and then I tend to like to get some demographic information, whether you've got that beforehand or after. In this case, it was language teachers, so it was related to their language information there as well. So yeah, that's a force one there. So when they finally click submit, all that data then goes to wherever you directed it to, like an online database, like there's a few that you can plug in, and then you export that, and I'll show you how you kind of put that into the analysis software a little bit later on. But that's just a quick run through of what the participants will experience there. So before we move on, are there any other questions anyone would like to ask me about that? Oh, good. Okay.
Just quickly,
Sure.
Gary, maybe we should have a break at 2 o'clock or 5 minutes.
Okay.
Just to heads up. Yeah, thank you.
Well, maybe it might be good then to have a break now because the next slides go into sort of the detail. So if we want to take a 5-minute break.
Sounds good.
And then we can come back and get into the specifics of each step of the process.
Thank you, Gary.
Okay, so now I'm going to, that diagram I showed you, the process, I'll just sort of unpack each of those steps there. So start off with the research question. So as I mentioned before, so that the subjective dimension of an issue to which different points of view can be expressed. Okay, so that's kind of sort of the guiding thing when you're thinking about your research question. And they tend to be simple and tightly focused. So you might explore the cause of something or the definitions or understandings, or maybe the outcomes. It could be a policy or something else. So these are just 3 examples. But what you wouldn't want to try and do is to try and do all 3 in one Q study. Because as I mentioned before, that condition of sort, the thing you're getting participants to be thinking about, you want that to be crystal clear and just one thing. Otherwise, someone might be thinking of part A and they're doing the Q sort. Someone might also be thinking of part B and they're doing the Q sort. So you end up with different Q sorts, but because they've been thinking of different things there. So clarity in your research question and simplicity is very important there. Mention the concourse from the Q set. So the concourse, that hypothetical idea of infinite set of possible expressions. And from that, you're sampling that to get your cue set, which is the set of statements that you're getting people to respond to. So to go to your question, Ek, in terms of the number, there's no real set number. In the Watson Center book that I talked about, they say maybe 40 to 80. I've done cue studies with 30 odd statements for younger people. It's just a matter about coverage. Are you getting all the important things you want people to respond to? And that's where the pilot can be good, because you can get people to say, do you think things are missing from this set of statements? Or you can look at where they've done that first step, and there's a lot of in the agree and very few in the disagree, or maybe you haven't really canvassed the other points of view of that. So it can come from places such as literature reviews. You can look at media. I've done studies where the topic itself hadn't really been explored that much before. So I did interviews with participants beforehand, and the transcripts became, I guess you could think of those as concourse. So that I sampled the transcripts to get the things they were talking about, and that became my cue set. So where you get it from is really wide open. The important thing is obviously to be rigorous in how you've done that, how you explain that process. And if you're doing a structured cue set where they're kind of lined up with maybe your theoretical framework or conceptual framework, thinking about how you decide how many statements fit in those categories as well could be important thing to think about. Piloting, ambiguity, you might read a statement, it makes sense to you, but a participant reads it in a different way. So getting all those sort of issues ironed out beforehand. Don't have double-barreled statements where it's got, I like ice cream and something else. You want them just to have one thing that they're thinking about, so that when you analyze their statements, where they put them, you're clear on what the thing is that they responded to. Okay. Now, so far I've used the word statements since that's text, but can also have other stimulus. I'll show you some studies like that later on. Images, people have done cue studies with music, works of art, perfumes, kind of pretty much anything you can think of, which is people can have an emotional response to. Is that stimulus, depending on what you're trying to explore. You want to try and make your statements fairly consistent in terms of the length, and also maybe there's a stem. For example, my attitude to language learning is something, 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 so that it's just consistent, so the person is not having to rethink what they're thinking about when they read the statement. So that can be quite good for the consistency of responses. And also length. If you've got a statement 1 or 2 words and a statement which is 20 words, that can sometimes cause issues in terms of people's reactions may be also influenced by the length of the statement. Be careful with negative statements. Because you're getting them on the grid, there's that sort of not like my view part. If you've got a negative statement, it's kind of like the double negative becomes a positive. So rather than saying, I don't like this, you might want to find a negative way or not a positive way to state that. So an example here is, rather than I don't find work enjoyable, I find work miserable, right? They can agree with that or disagree with that without any confusion around, is it a double negative? So that's the statements. In terms of the participants, so it's not a representative sample. You're not trying to get, X number of people in this category, because that's not what Q is designed to do. It's exploratory, right? So it's people who you think maybe hold a viewpoint about your topic of interest, and also because their perspectives matter for what you're trying to explore, okay? Also be careful about assumptions. So I'll give you an example. I did that Q study I showed you there. These were pre-service teachers of different languages, for example, Japanese, Chinese, Spanish, German, Italian, and French as well, and a few others. And I had the initial idea, well, maybe the teachers of character languages will kind of coalesce around a similar viewpoint, and maybe the teachers of European languages will coalesce. it didn't turn out that way. They were kind of all mixed up. So Q can somewhat surprise you because you might think, well, all these people, they seem to be having this similarity about whatever it may be, but that doesn't predetermine where they might end up in terms of the factor. There could be a whole range of other things that influence them. So while demographic data can be useful when you're looking at the factors to try and interpret them, often it can be quite different from what you may have expected there. Okay. Another thing about Q, which can be quite good, is people whose viewpoint may be less visible or canvassed in the literature. Q can give them a way for their voice to be heard. And you'll see that in the analysis as well, where you might have maybe marginalized groups or groups who are often not canvassed on their viewpoints. Q can be a good way to elevate and surface their viewpoints, which are often which can be overlooked. So where in maybe a survey, some of that data may be lost because of, it's not in the process, it may be kind of not seen as much as maybe it should be. In Q, you can often really hone in on those voices there, which may be an important part of your study. Okay. So leaning question there, suitable for our research. How can we decide if Q is suitable? So yeah, is it exploratory? Is it something that is sort of new, or the way you're approaching it is new, or you're looking at it with a different theoretical lens? Are the people who you're trying to find out about, do we maybe not know as much as we should about it? Or do you think only the dominant voices have been heard and you're trying to look at maybe the marginalized voices? So that could be where Q is quite powerful. Yeah, so definitely not where you're trying to find out the number of people who think a certain thing. It's more about what are they thinking about. So anything where you think there's a lack of information about these viewpoints, that would be where Q would be probably a good option. Okay, moving forward. The sorting grid, I mentioned this before, they tend to be forced, and the ones you see there are what are called forced distributions. So you predetermine what it looks like. How many columns you have is up to you, depending on how many statements you have. I tend to like to have at least 2 grids at the extremities, because I find a lot of people don't want to, they have 2 things they really hold really deeply. It's like asking someone with 2 children, which one do you love the most? I mean, they're never going to tell you. Give them the option of putting them both there, all right? It's not going to make too much of a difference in the analysis, but for some people, they just find that a bit of an easier choice to make there. When you present it, you might want to think about, do you want to put numbers on it? You don't need to. You might just have the label, least like my view, or most like, I agree with the most or disagree with the most. You play around with it and see what's going to suit your particular study and your participants there. Look at other Q studies, see what they've done as well. As I said, I think the less labeling, the better, because it can maybe influence people more than you might think. And as I just mentioned there, having 2 cells at the extremities can be quite helpful there. Condition of instruction, that's that prompt. The wording tends to be linked to your theoretical framework, what you're trying to sort of use to understand what their viewpoints are. And you can do it in a couple of ways. You can get it to be self-referential, what they think, but you could also get them to think, well, when you think about it, what's your viewpoint? And then they do another Q sort. What view do you express to other people? So if you've got a sensitive topic, people might have 2 ways they think about that. One, their own one, and one that they feel they can express to other people. Okay. So there where you do kind of different conditions of sort. So you want to make sure it's really clear, have it written down so they can see it, and kind of maybe remind them of it, that they want to have that in mind as they're doing their Q sort. Okay, in terms of data analysis, I did mention that you tend to do interviews with them as soon as possible, ideally as soon as they've done the Q sort. But that data there can also be useful on its own. All right, so some ways you might do that at the interviews. You can also, maybe if you want to get people to think aloud as they're doing the Q sort, sometimes people will talk about the statements and say, oh, I don't understand this one, or yeah, I really agree with this one, or they might reference other things. If you're recording, that can be additional data you might want to explore. You can also ask them things like, at the end, was there something missing you think should have been there? All right. Now, you can't include that in the analysis, but it may be something you talk about in the qualitative write-up as well. The participants were mentioning these other statements that they thought could have been relevant there. Once you've written up the data, you can also go back to the participants and say, look, this is how this is where you've ended up, the viewpoint in the analysis, and this is my description of that viewpoint. Does this resonate with you? Do you see yourself in this description? So that sort of member validation, participant validation of the narrative can be another way you can use that data there. So just to give you an example, I did a Q study. This is back during COVID. We're looking at EAL teachers and their experience of teaching online during that period. So we did a Q study, but also the interviews, and then just the interview data, we're able to kind of use that. And this is just a piece for the conversation, talking about what these teachers were saying about that experience there. So when you're doing Q studies, you can think about the data, you can have that integral aspect of it, the quant and the qual, but also sometimes the qual data can be rich source of information you could use on a standalone study as well. Okay, I hope I'm not missing any questions there. Okay, pause. I know I've been answering questions along the way, but does anyone like to ask a question before I think I'm going to jump into some of the software?
Sorry, Gary. If nobody else wants to ask, I might jump in with another.
Go ahead.
I was just having a quick glance at that EALD study publication that you had with Yvette Slaughter. Is that right?
Yep.
I was
correct.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about the publication process with a Q method paper. Like, how did you find that to go?
Yeah, good question. I've actually got a slide at the end stepping you through some of the steps there of that. Look, the good thing is Q is becoming more and more well-known. So in the past, where you would often have reviewers who either they're quant and they would look at it and say, the factor analysis doesn't make sense to them, or qual people will look at it and say, why are you looking at subjectivity with factor analysis? Nowadays, you get more and more reviewers who are at least aware of it, and you can even sometimes, with some journals, they might ask you to nominate potential reviewers. You might know people. My suggestion would be look at the journal, have they published a Q paper already, and you might want to remind them of that in the cover letter, just to preempt that. So, but generally, I would say with it becoming more and more widely used in a range of fields, that battle is becoming less of an issue. Okay, so software. This is, I'm going to step you through sort of the main ones here. There are other ones. This one here, PQ method, this is the one I used when I started using Q for my PhD. And what you see there is basically what it is. It's very much a DOS type of interface where you're manually entering the data, and it then spits out a whole bunch of these factors, and then you've got to analyze that and go back and re-enter the data again and set a whole thing. So very time consuming, but still, this is still, you'll see this cited in papers even published these days. So Peter Schmock is still relatively active, sort of semi-retired. It's a free software, and it's still used. So that's something just to be aware of if you're interested in having a look at that. This one here is the one that I tend to use more. This is the free one, which is multi-platform. As you can see there, Mac, Linux, also works off a USB pen drive. And this is the one also, so Sean Banasic has created the online part. So you have collecting the data and then analyzing the data. So this is the one to analyze the data there. So they're hosted on GitHub, and you download that. And I'm going to, if we get time, hopefully I'll show you what that looks like in terms of the analysis there. Also, some of you might be using R in terms of your software. So there are packages. So Aora Zabala from the UK created a package, an R package that you can plug in. And this gives you lots of options there in terms of also outputs. You can do a whole range of nice sort of graphical outputs. For example, stuff like this where you want to represent all the factors on one grid there. So on the left-hand side of the statements, on the bottom of our Z-scores, and each of those dots there, we've got the red for the factors, and they're sort of distributed depending on how strongly or they agreed or disagreed with each of these statements there. Right. So those are things to play around with, and these are people in the Q community also still fairly active. So often these are getting updated and improved along the way there. So you do your Q analysis, and I'll get to that in a minute, but just to show you kind of what it looks like. So this is a sample composite grid. So imagine if you all had done a Q sort. I got you each to do that Q sort I showed you. I put it into the software, and what it's going to try and do through the factor analysis is going to try and find patterns of where amongst your participants were there points where people coalesced in the way they arranged the statements, were there similarities in the arrangement. And if you're looking at 1, 2, maybe even 3 Q sorts as a person, you could maybe start to look at that. But when you're getting more than that as a human, it's just too many data points for us to sort of think about. So to give you an idea of the number of combinations or permutations of arrangements, if you had a Q sort with, say, 33 statements on a 9-column grid, I think the number is like 3.6 times 10 to the power of 25, which is like 36 septillion variations of arrangements. So septillion is like 24 zeros after it, or 25. So obviously as a human, we're not going to be able to kind of deal with those numbers there. So that's where the factor analysis is doing that work for you, looking for where there are similarities of. So this is what it will produce. This is a composite grid. So it's not going to look like any one individual grid exactly. It's going to kind of pull together where they kind of agreed and create a composite grid. So if I went back to the people who were in this factor and I said, and I looked at their grid, it wouldn't be exactly the same, but it would be similar, and that level of similarity would be shown in their factor loading, how strongly they were identified within this group. So if you want to think of it visually, if your viewpoint, imagine like a flagpole, the people closest to it would be the ones that this composite one would look the closest like their one. The people sort of a little bit further away, it would start to be a little bit different. Then as they move further and further away, their arrangement will maybe be a mixture of this viewpoint and another viewpoint, and that's what we call a confounded sort. So their arrangement is kind of half like one viewpoint and half like another, and that tends to be kind of excluded from the analysis because you can't really say they strongly enough align with one viewpoint or another. What can also happen, you might get a participant who doesn't align with any particular viewpoint. So that one is a non-significant viewpoint. So again, it's excluded from the analysis, but it doesn't mean you still can't look at that, and particularly the interview data might be interesting, but you wouldn't say that they are strongly enough within that viewpoint to include them in there. Will it be normally distributed? No, and you'll see that in the analysis. It tends to be you'll get, again, it depends on the topic, depends on your statements, your participants, but as you'll see, you'll get maybe tend to be a larger group for your first factor, and then second one, third one, the numbers will decrease. But this is where you, as the researcher, are getting your hands dirty because you're making decisions about how many factors to keep. And that can also be influenced by who your participants are, which I'll try and show you in a minute. You'll see a few other things on that diagram there down the bottom, distinguishing statement. So here, these are where they're statistically significant compared to the other factors. You could say that that statement there is placed on this grid statistically significant from the other factors, from where the other factors have had that statement there. All right. And that's at those different levels there, at a confidence level of 5% or 1%. And the Z scores as well will help you sort of find the key differences between each factor as well. So you can see, you can look at the statements at the extremities as an interesting point to explore. You can look at the distinguishing statements. You can look at the Z scores as well. You can also look at consensus statements. So these are ones where across all your factors, they've ended up basically in a similar position on the grid. So you can say amongst all my participants, this seems to be a core thing that they all have placed in a similar position. Yeah, that sort of preempts this slide here. So how do you interpret your grids? Well, as I said, statements at the extremities, and that's often something we explored in the interview because you get to sort of tell you why they've agreed or disagreed with that. The rankings of the statements in terms of comparison to other factors, that's your Z scores. All right. These are where you're starting to construct a narrative. And that, again, your interview data helps you start to create that. You can look at demographic data as well. So, for example, the EAL study, interestingly, those teachers were from across the state, so some in regional, rural, metro areas. And I thought that would be a key factor, a key kind of distinguishing characteristic that would for the factors. But actually, it turned out it wasn't that. We had one factor. We had someone rural Victoria and a couple of people in metro area. So this is what I said about sometimes the demographics can be useful, but they also can be sometimes not irrelevant, but not what you might expect. Yeah, so kind of what I've said there, looking at the qualitative data. So you can see here, it's kind of like a process where you're spending time looking at all your data points and sort of building up a picture of what does this factor tell me about this particular viewpoint. Some people will name their factors, and this sometimes can be good for people reading the paper. They want to get like a little pithy, little 4 or 5 word descriptive of it. I tend to try not to do that. I just call it factor A, factor B, because sometimes you can think words represent something, but someone else can read something else to it. And often you're compromising maybe the full picture by trying to really condense it into 2 or 3 words. Having said that, people do tend to do it, but I would say just be careful of that because you might be sort of putting out a really description of that factor, which is not giving the full picture or could be misleading. In terms of software, there's some of the links there, and I said I can share these slides with you. There's the free ones, there's some paid versions. The VQ method is the paid one. And some of these, as I said, they're sort of constantly being updated, but there's quite a bit out there and there's more and more available as we go. Questions? Or I'm conscious of time, I want to show you some of the actual software and how it works. So I might power on if that's okay. But if you've got a question, please add it to the chat and I'll keep an eye on it. I did mention visuals. So this is some Q studies more from fields such as sustainability, environmental studies, but also relevant, I think, for applied linguistics. And you can see from the explanation here. So they said, we used images because we're interested in land uses and landforms, which are more easily captured by images than short statements. And they expected participants to react to them more readily. But also going down in the green there, their participants were, this is in Wales, and most of them spoke Welsh. And a lot of the expressions, maybe if they put them in English, they didn't quite capture the full sense of the word as it would be in Welsh. So they felt images were more useful for that. So if you're thinking of study, you've got participants in different areas, different linguistic backgrounds, you might either go with their first language and then translate it later on when you do the analysis if you have to, or maybe an image might be more suitable for your participant, particularly where you're dealing with participants who are illiterate or pre-literate and where they might be excluded from traditional studies where they're not able to engage with a survey, but a Q study with images could be a good way. Or you could have audio, they could click something and hear it and then respond to it. So this is where I've talked about Q can be a much more inclusive approach to people who are often maybe overlooked in traditional data collection methods. Children as well. So this one was a study done, this was in the area of child development, looking at their experiences of divorce. Often children at that age, they're not going to be able to explain their feelings. They're not going to really have the words to really express that, but images are a way that they can express their feelings. All right. So this is an option there if you've got participants, maybe younger ones, where you might find images can be more useful. And the book I showed you earlier on, the Q in language education, there's a study there with children Korean where they used images as well. So you can see there a good way to give voice to often participants who may be overlooked because traditional research methods are just, they're quite exclusive for them. Oh, yeah, I mention it's the slide I added in a little bit later. This is the one I mentioned about the Australian Korean multicultural family members. That's in that book, using images for them to sort of arrange. You can see there are far fewer pictures there because of the age group there. So that's where you would adapt to that. Other options with Q, something that I'm really interested in, this idea of longitudinal studies. So Nicola Morea in the UK, he did a kind of a systematic review looking at all the Q studies that were longitudinal and they're done in different ways. As I said, I've been doing this study for about 5 years with pre-service teachers, both following up participants over 5 years, but also adding new participants each year with the same Q set, which is that set that I showed you before. So that allows me with the same research instrument to be consistent in how I can analyze the data. And also for them as well, it's quite interesting because they do it and they say things like, oh yeah, I think 2 years ago, I probably put this statement over here, but now I really feel I disagree with this statement. So they're able to, through the research instrument, really reflect on what may have changed in their viewpoint as well. Some people use Q as a starting point, as that idea of exploratory research tool to then scale up through a larger study, more participants to inform a survey. So there are people who, in the UK, in Europe, who will do a study and they'll start with the Q, and then from the statements, from the factors, they'll then use that to inform their survey construction with their subscales and so on. And that's the way that they can both get that really rich qualitative information about what do people think, and then go to looking at, well, how many people think these things in that more of a traditional large-scale study. Getting to Q publications, there is a chapter in that book, the Stenner and Watts one, where they actually give you some really useful advice. Stephen Brown kind of like, I guess, the main person in Q. He's very active on the listserv. There's a listserv you can join, which is you see on the thing there. He tends to say as Q becomes more and more recognized, there's less of a need to justify Q. Often you look at early papers where you half the part of the paper would be about why did you choose Q and why is it okay to do it, and et cetera, et cetera. That's becoming less of an issue, just like you don't need to justify other research methods. Why should you need to justify Q? So keep that in mind. It's becoming more accepted, more acknowledged. But my advice, as I said, maybe find a journal that already has published one, remind the editor, and if you don't get a chance to nominate someone who is familiar with Q, that could be a good strategy as well. How are we going for time? I might, as I said, I'll give you a chance now to ask any questions through your microphone, or if you want to add them to the chat. While you're doing that, I might open up the software and just show you what the process could look like. So let me stop sharing. Any questions while I'm doing this? Okay, I'll make sure I leave some time at the end to maybe some more questions towards the end. But this is the software I showed you, CADE, Sean Banasic, the one that runs on a range of platforms. And this is what it looks like when you download it. It's great software because it's quite small and also runs from a portable device and multiple platforms as well. And the good thing about it, a few things, is it's multilingual. So if you want to work in another language, you can change it to, and these are constantly being added as it's more translations are being done. But I'll go back to English for now. Inglese. And the other good thing about this one is it gives you some demo data. All right. So if I go to the first step, input, so the participants have done their Q sort, they've clicked submit, the data goes to your database, you download it, typically like a JSON file, JSON, which is a data file, and then you can import it into this. And this one will give you some templates. So you can download these Excel templates and then put your data into those and then put it into the software. There's a few different ones of those. There's that PQ method one I mentioned before. But when you want to start out and just get an idea of how it works, this demo data can be very good. And I'm going to use one of these now. So this lipset data is probably the one you'll see the most in the literature. So this comes from the Stephen Brown book, the one I mentioned, Political Subjectivity, 1980. And this was a study done with just 9 participants, 33 statements. So if I load that data, and I'll show you what that looks like. So we get a visual feedback here. And as I said, the PQ method one, you would need to do this manually and it just takes a long time. Here, you're getting the information straight away. So it's much more user-friendly. The first step is, I need to check the data. So here, 9 participants, 33 statements. This is what the grid would look like. So this would have -4 plus 4. And then in the -4, there were 2 slots, then 3 and 5. So that shows you what the grid looked at like. And then these are my statements. So you want to check all that looks okay. So you confirm that. You can also export that if you want to. Then when I go down below, I can see visually each of my participants, what their Q sort looked like. All right, so participant US1, they had statement 27 at the +4. So I can look at that, I can go back and check. So I can always make sure my data is accurate and it's been imported correctly. And again, you can also export that as a spreadsheet if you want to keep it. Once you've done that, you go to the correlations. So here, again, with 9 participants, we've got our correlation grid. And you can see, as you would expect, participant US1 correlates perfectly with themselves, 100%. And just as a first step, you get to see who on this initial phase they may be similar to. For example, US2 and US 1.54, you're going to think they're going to be, it's highly likely they're going to end up maybe on a similar factor. Not necessarily, depends on how many factors you choose, but this just gives you a first eyeball look at the data to see where your participants might end up. From there, we go to the actual factor, the calculation of that. And in this software and most others, apart from the R, where you've got more options, you generally get two, centroid factor or principal components analysis. Centroid factors, I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that before. It's probably one of the original ways of doing factor analysis before, I think, almost computers. So you could do it by hand. In the Q community, there are people who will say that that's what you should do. And that's linked to the next step, which is rotation, where you're rotating the axes and maybe looking at the factors from different perspectives. I'll show you what that looks like. Principal components, more familiar, more well-known, also for journals as well. The good thing here, you can try one, have a look, try another one and see. You'll find probably a lot of people will be choosing more principal components because that's what they're familiar with. All right. But what that does, it's set up to give you a default 8 factors, right? And with 9 participants, you probably think, well, that's probably a bit too many, but that's the way it's just set up to give you those first 8. And then it will also give you things such as how much the explained variance of those 8 factors there, and the cumulative explained variance of those factors there. You've got a screw plot. Again, you can start to look at and think, well, how many of these factors should I need to maintain? And these can also be exported as well. So you might find these could be useful later on if you want to include them in your publication as well. I'm just kind of rushing through there. I know maybe you've got a lot of questions here, but I just want to make sure I show you all the steps before we kind of run out of time. The next step is the rotation. This is where you're thinking, okay, how many factors am I going to keep? And that's going to be based on a number of things. If I go back to this one, I can arrange these by the strength of the factor, okay? So where you've got a higher number, it means this participant is more strongly aligned with that viewpoint. All right. Now, there are calculations you can do based on the number of statements that'll give you a threshold. All right. So below a certain number, you can say statistically that this participant it couldn't be considered as loading onto this factor. All right. So there are some 2 or 3 different things you can look at to give you a guide. In this case, we've got 9 participants, and I know in this particular case, there were 3 factors that ended up as being retained. And then we can get to the rotation. So what the principal components analysis and the Varimax, basically what it's going to give you is the cleanest mathematical solution or analysis of your Q sorts, okay? So if I was to apply that Varimax rotation, I would end up, it's looked at those 9 Q sorts, it's tried to look at where they put all the statements, and then it's grouped them, in this case, into 3 main groupings, which is factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, all right? And in this software, you can do what's called auto flagging. So basically just based on a threshold, it's putting those people into groups, and also it's going to arrange them in the strength of their Q sort with that composite Q sort. So if I was to go to participant US2 and look at their Q sort, because they're 0.82, remembering the highest is 1, their Q sort is going to look very, very similar to the composite one. And as I go down, those participants are going to be a little bit more and more different. Okay? Now, how many factors? As I said, there are calculations you can do to work out a threshold, but these are also things where you might look and see, all right, say you did and you had 4 factors and you had one person on a factor. Now, there's a general rule that with only one person, you might not want to keep that factor because there's not enough there to really talk about it. It's just one person. But suppose that person, I'll give you an example. I did a Q study where we're looking at early childhood educators and their viewpoints towards the linguistic resources of children in daycare. So children often with diverse linguistic backgrounds. And when we did the factor analysis, there was one person that ended up by themselves on one factor. And you might think, well, okay, that's just one person. It's probably not enough to really talk about. But when we looked at the information about that person was also a language teacher. All right. The other ones were early childhood educators, but didn't have any language teaching background or pedagogical knowledge and so on. But this particular person did. So they were responding to the Q sort with their knowledge of language learning, language teaching, linguistic resources. So that's a case where you might think, no, that it factor is important because this person's viewpoint is quite valuable. All right. Or another example where you're looking at say a university, and you look at the Q sorts and one of them's out there by themselves, but that happens to be the vice chancellor. All right. Now, probably their viewpoint is quite important because it's going to influence a lot of things. So this is where I talked before about you are in the data analysis process, looking at this not just from the numbers, you're also looking at it from the bigger picture as well. Your knowledge of the theory, your knowledge of the interviews you may have done, your knowledge of the participants and so on. So you're starting to make those decisions there. The important thing you need to do is be really rigorous in how you document that and the decisions you make and how you come to those decisions, because you'll probably be asked at various stages, well, how did you come up with 3 factors and not 4 and so on? One thing you'll notice in factor 2, participant JP5 is a negative. So that's what's called a bipolar factor. So that person there, their factor, their sort is almost the mirror opposite of the other 2 people in that Q sort. So rather than being on a separate factor, they're just like whatever the other 2 participants said, they were kind of like the opposite. So that's where you have what's called a bipolar factor. So just brushing through here, we can send this to an output. It'll give us all of this in a really detailed Excel spreadsheet with about 30 or 40 tabs with all of the information you would ever want to start to look at this. We'll have each factor, the distinguishing statements, consensus statements, Z scores, comparison between factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, and so on. So the output is detailed, extensive, and really rich to give you information you need to do your analysis, along with the other data you've collected through interviews and so on. So let me go back, send to output, and maybe I can just show you. I will select all of those, submit them, and I'll show you. So here I've got our 3 factors. It gives me the correlation between factors. So these ones are quite low. So that's kind of showing me that these factors are distinct. There's not too much crossover. The factor table here with remember I did a bipolar, so I ended up with 2A and 2B. I can see with the Z scores, kind of normalized score, where they were which statements were more strongly for this particular group. So for example, factor 1, statement 30, very strongly disagreed. If I look over, for example, factor 3, that was more strongly towards the agree area. So this is a nice table. I can start to see straight away differences and similarities between groups. I mentioned before distinguishing statements. These are the ones which are statistically different between your factors, between your viewpoints. And now you can also get those composite grids, is what I showed you before. So you can download these as vector images. And again, these are sometimes you'll upload these as appendices in your journal articles or your thesis if you're doing it as a part of your thesis there. It does give you a project log, just kind of the basic steps. But as I said, you need to create a really detailed journal of that as you're going through. So I think we're close to time. I'll pause here, maybe stop sharing and see if anyone has any other questions you'd like to ask. Okay, well, oh no, sorry, that was 6 new, sorry. Okay. Negative loadings. So you mean for the, okay, the depending how strong it is, it would if it's that where it's above the threshold, it would become a bipolar. So it's like these two people are kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum on that particular thing. All right. So that's normally how you would look at those ones if they were above your threshold for retaining them in that factor. Yeah, Anthony, that's just the free version of the software, so you can go download that. And as I said, there's 4 sets of demo data to play around with. And yeah, you're lucky these days because you can just keep on clicking and altering things. Back with the PQ method, it was a long, laborious process of entering in things by hand. Other questions? I don't know if I missed any.
I have a quick question, Gary. With the 2 methods for factor analysis, right? You have 2 options. Would they yield the same results, or which one is more difficult to learn?
Okay. So yeah, maybe I will see if I can share again and show you. So going back to the rotations, I skipped over. So judgmental rotation is where you have maybe usually some sort of theory-informed thing you're looking for. So that's when you've got rather than just the clean mathematical solution, you want to look at where your participants ended up in the axes and rotate that axis around. Not that you're changing any of the data, the data is still consistent. You're just changing your viewpoint, where you're looking at it from. And that can be useful where there's a particular participant you want to focus on, or you see there's a bit of it's a bit murky, a bit kind of unclear. So you think, okay, let me rotate this factor 1 and factor 2. I want to look at it from this participant's point of view and see where they line up with in terms of other people. So that's called that judgmental, something that's called manual rotation, hand rotation. Tends to be where that's kind of linked to that idea of abduction, where it's not purely deductive, it's not purely inductive. It's a bit of, okay, here's some information. I've also know some things about it. I'm going to try to use that to explore the data and see if I can understand it a bit, from a different perspective. So if you look at Q studies, and they should say that, what they did, varimax or hand rotation, and ideally they want to give you information about why they did that and how they did that. In the software, you can go in. It's very easy to do that. You just set the sort of degrees of rotation. You choose the factors. But if you're starting out, I think generally probably principal components analysis combined with varimax is going to give you a pretty good initial first step. It's going to be fairly well accepted in terms of journals, and until you maybe become more comfortable and more confident, or you have a particular thing you're looking for, that's when maybe the judgmental rotation might be something to start to explore.
Thank you, Gary. I think what I meant was the centroid factor versus the principal component one, then when you want to extract the factors.
Right.
If you similar outcomes when we do that.
Yeah. The studies that I've seen that have done that comparison, they tend to say they're going to be similar. It's just with centroid, which was the initial factor analysis that Stevenson used, because this was, remember, done before computers, so it was more just hand calculation. The argument is that it lended itself more to judgmental rotation. I think there's also so there's a bit of maybe tradition and a bit of theory around it that it's aligned more with sort of the theoretical or philosophical foundations of Q, where you would choose centroid. But if you go into software like SPSS, as far as I know, you won't even find centroid analysis in there because it's just been superseded with, the more up to date options there. Other questions?
Gary, this is going back to earlier, not the analysis, but creating the statements. I'm still likely confused about that part because I feel like the selection of the statements is so incredibly important for the outcomes, and forcing participants to kind of sort them into a normal distribution seems also a little bit problematic in my eyes because not everyone might see them in that way. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. And then my second question is, you talked about earlier around the number of statements, but we saw in your example data there in the statistics programs that there were huge differences in the participant numbers. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about number of statement versus participant numbers, and at what point it just becomes kind of ludicrous to do a factor analysis like we just saw with 9 participants or something. It just seems kind of not robust in my eyes, but I don't know.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the statements, yeah, definitely that's where you need to take time to really think about your statements. So where are you getting them from? And as I mentioned before, doing pilots. So the pilots could be choosing experts, like a sort of Delphi study where experts in the field, you get them to look at it. Also, people who are similar to your participants, to read them, to make sure they're understandable from their perspective. Also looking at them in terms of if you've got a theory which is informing your study, do these statements allow you to apply that theory and analyze the factors and the statements using the theory to sort of explain what they've done there. So that's what probably in the first point I mentioned there. Doing a Q study is not something you take on lightly. You need to really think about each step of the way and take great care with that. In terms of the forced distribution, I think on one of my slides there I showed you can do it unforced, right? You can make it the participant can put the statements where they like. So they could have all of them that they agree. It does create a few issues though, and I think in some ways it's like, well, maybe just do a survey. Because if you're letting them put them wherever they like and just all in one area of the grid, you're sort of almost taking out the idea that you're trying to get them to look at statements in relation to each other. They almost then become discrete items. So that may be where more of a survey more suitable. It is true, some people feel frustrated when they're having to make decisions about which statements they agree with more or less. And they just sometimes they say, I can't make a choice between these two. So that's where I said, like, you might, as they don't make it one at the very end, just have two. It's just a bit of a compromise. But even if they've got, say it's a 4 and a 5, if they can't decide, well, one or the other, it's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference in the analysis because it's sort of in that ballpark area there. But I found in most of my studies, people, they hold viewpoints about some things, but they tend to not hold strong viewpoints about every single thing. All right. So if you give them a range of statements, there'll be some of those statements that, yep, I'm definitely totally agree with this. Where other statements are like, yeah, look, I'm sort of, neither here nor there. And that's where that sort of the middle of the grid, which is not neutral, it's less salient, right? So they may agree with it, but not as strongly as the other one. So that's in terms of the statements. And your next question was about in terms of the number of participants, right? Or the number of statements. So this is where the traditional factor analysis is a little bit different in terms of the cube, because traditional factor analysis, you would be thinking, I need to get a certain number of participants to make, my study meaningful, the numbers make sense. But remember in Q, it's not that you're sampling a population of people, it's the statements, the concourse, which you're sampling to generate your statements. And your participants are expressing their subjectivity on those statements there, right? So as long as you can say that you are getting participants who have a viewpoint about your topic, all right, and have something to say about it. Remember, you're not looking for representing the sort of ratio of people who think of a certain thing. You're trying to find out what these people think. So you're interested in these people. What are their viewpoints about this particular topic? So there are Q studies done with one part. You can do a single person Q study where you're looking at one participant and you might give them different prompts. All right, what's your viewpoint? What's the viewpoint you expressed for your colleagues? What's the viewpoint you expressed when you were younger? So you can get them to be responding to different prompts, but it's the same person doing the Q sort. So you're looking for differences there. There are some papers that talk about the ratio of or the number of statements in relation to participants. So that's where that number 40 to 80 comes in, saying that if you have fewer than that, you can then start to compromise the rigor of the analysis. But there are also papers and plenty of, like Stephen Brown's written quite a few ones, were showing that, for example, that LipSet data with 33 statements, 9 participants, where it still can be a useful study when you're trying to explore the shared viewpoints amongst those participants.
And is there any guidance on at what point it's just too many statements? Because I took part in a study like that and I can't remember how many statements there were, but at some point you can't think anymore, because you've got to think deeply about each statement. That's right.
So that's where too many, like that 80, I've never done one with 80. I think that's too many. In terms of just time and, as you say, cognitive load. So that would be like the sort of upper limits, I would say. But again, doing a pilot study and getting people's response to it, is it too demanding on them? And doing that first step where they're getting into 3 groups can be helpful because it breaks down that cognitive load. Because the second time they're engaging with the statements, they've already read it and had an initial feeling to it. But yeah, I would say, I don't know, I think the most I've ever used is probably, 50 or so, and that was sufficient for what I was trying to explore. But I've seen some, go up 80, even more. So yeah, really, it depends on a number of factors. But definitely your participants and what they're able to manage will be a key consideration.
Can that first sort, can the statements be randomized so that not everyone sees them in the same order?
Yeah, you can randomize them, and also you didn't see it, but each of those statements was linked to one of my sort of theoretical concepts, and you can make sure those are mixed up as well, so they're not all getting the statements related to this thing or that thing. So yeah, they can see them. But remember, they're doing it individually as well. Although I actually have done Q studies when I was doing it in a school with students, and had about 5 or 6 students in one room together. They were kind of spread out. It was paper-based. They all did it individually, but they're all in the same room. But they're not really seeing each other. So you only want them to see each other's statements, arrangements, because you don't want to think, is that the right way to do it? Or, am I doing it the wrong way? You want them to just be engaging individually with no right or wrong way to do it.
Yeah, but I was thinking more of that not everyone is tired at the same statements. You know what I mean? Because you'll pay more attention with the first 10 maybe, and then it'll just be
Yeah. As I said, when I do them online, I always do them in a Zoom. I say, right, when have you got an hour free? And they're in the Zoom and they're doing it. I'm sort of turn my camera off, and they take about 20, 30 minutes. And then we come back in, I get them to show me their grid. And then we just talk through it. Tell me about these statements, tell me about these ones. And you're getting to really give you examples of things that came to their mind as they were thinking of where that statement goes. Because that gives you not only what they think, but why they think that.
Thank you, everyone. I think that's all we have time for. It's so engaging, Gary. I'm so excited. I feel like we need to have more sessions on this. Oops. We haven't actually talked too much about the interview part, right? Like where we get more of that story from.
Yeah.
That might be something that also is.
Sure. Yeah, look, if anyone wants to reach out to me, my details are on the slides, but you probably got them as well. Happy to share anything. I will share the slides. And if you're doing a Q study and you need someone to have a look at something you're not sure about, I'm always happy to help.
Thank you so much, Gary, for your contribution to this. Very, very useful for everyone. I'm sure everyone appreciate your contribution and help with this. Thank you all, everyone. Wishing you a lovely weekend, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.